Right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Linwood Forte case, the Nightstalker who terrorized Goldsboro, North Carolina back in 1990. And we've got a lot of sources for this one, news articles, court records, and more to really try to piece together what happened.
Ugh, yeah, it's fascinating to see how this case sort of unfolded. You've got a small town suddenly faced with the prospect of having a serial killer in their midst.
Yeah, totally changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So let's set the scene. Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1990. The first sign of trouble comes on May 26th when 70-year-old Eliza Jones is attacked in her home. Her daughter actually interrupted the attack. The assailant fled.
Yeah.
But the really unsettling thing here is that Eliza couldn't remember any details about the attack.
Yeah, and that actually, the inability to recall traumatic events is a common response to extreme stress and trauma, and it really speaks to the level of violence and fear that she must have experienced.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah.
But then, just 2 months later, July 14th, another attack. This time the victim is 79-year-old Hattie Davis Bonner. And she doesn't survive the method suffocation eerily similar to the first attack.
Right, and it's at this point that investigators start to see a pattern.
Mhm.
Elderly victims' attacks happening late at night, the use of strangulation or suffocation. It's enough to at least raise the question, are we dealing with a serial predator?
Right. So at this stage, how often do investigators miss these early patterns? Is there anything they could have done differently?
Well, early on, it's natural to look for other explanations, even if they are coincidences. The idea of a serial killer, operating in your town is a terrifying thought. So there's almost a reluctance to accept that possibility.
Right. It makes sense. But as we know, this was far from over because on October 6th, the case took an even darker turn.
Yeah.
Alvin Bowen, 78 years old, and his wife Stelma, who was 75 and blind, were attacked in their home.
This attack was particularly brutal. Alvin was stabbed multiple times and Thelma was strangled. And then the attacker set the house on fire and the car as well. It's a chilling escalation in the level of violence.
Boy, they set the car on fire, too.
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
Well, it seems like an attempt to destroy evidence, to create chaos and hinder the investigation. But the thing is, the fire was contained before it reached the bedroom where Alvin and Thelma were found, so crucial evidence survived.
Oh, wow. Talk about a stroke of luck for investigators in the middle of this horrific scene.
Yeah.
But at this point, the fear in Goldsboro must have been palpable.
Oh, absolutely. Rumors of a serial killer were spreading like wildfire, creating anxiety, uncertainty. You can imagine the impact on a small, close-knit community like Goldsboro. It's like the shared trauma, really.
Right. And what was the police response at this point? Surely they couldn't ignore the similarities any longer.
You would think so, right? But there was still some initial resistance to labeling these attacks as the work of a serial killer.
Really? Why is that?
I think it's sometimes there's a reluctance to accept the idea of something so sinister happening in your own backyard. It's almost like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, I guess it's easier to believe in coincidence than in a monster hiding in plain sight.
Right.
But, with each attack, the evidence must have been mounting.
Absolutely. The pattern was becoming too clear to ignore elderly victims' attacks, focused on weekends, homes located near vacant lots, the preference for strangulation. These details, along with that escalating brutality, kind of forced the police to confront the horrifying reality that they were dealing with a serial killer.
So Goldsboro's on edge.
Mm-hmm.
The police are finally acknowledging the threat. What happens next? Do they make any progress in identifying the Nightstalker?
Unfortunately, no. Despite a $2,000 reward offered by Crime Stoppers, the case went cold. No solid leads, no suspects, just a terrified community haunted by this chilling nickname, the Nightstalker.
Wow, that's unsettling. What are some of the common reasons why a case like this with such a clear pattern would go cold?
Well, there are a lot of factors that can contribute to that. Sometimes it's a lack of resources. Sometimes investigators get fixated on a particular theory and they overlook some crucial evidence. And sometimes it's just bad luck, plain and simple.
So for years, Goldsboro lived under this shadow of fear, with no answers in sight. It must have felt like the Nightstalker had just vanished into thin air.
It's a stark reminder that even with dedicated efforts, some cases just hit dead ends, and it's incredibly frustrating and disheartening for both investigators and the community who are searching for answers. For a while, it seemed like the Nightstalker would remain this haunting enigma, this chilling reminder of these unsolved crimes that plagued Goldsboro.
I have heavy thought, but I have a feeling the story doesn't end there. This is a deep dive after all.
Right.
So what finally changed the course of this investigation? What happened next?
Well, that's where things take a fascinating turn, and it all hinges on this seemingly unrelated event. In 1996, Linwood Forte was already a convicted felon. He had fired a gun in his own home, and because of that, he was required to submit a DNA sample to authorities.
Interesting. So how does a DNA sample from an unrelated incident connect to the Nightstalker case? It seems like a complete coincidence.
It might seem that way, but this seemingly random event would prove to be pivotal in the investigation. You see, this was the early 2000s, and DNA technology was rapidly advancing. Remember CODIS?
Yehudas, refresh my memory.
Right, CODIS is the national DNA database, and it allows law enforcement to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes to a vast network of samples from convicted felons. It was, and still is, a game changer for solving crimes, especially cold cases.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. So Forte's DNA is in the system, but what prompted investigators to run his profile against the evidence from the Nightstalker case? Was there a specific clue that pointed them in his direction?
Not exactly. In this case, it wasn't a specific tip or a sudden breakthrough that led to the connection. It was the systematic power of CODIS doing its job. 5 years after Forte submitted his sample in 2001, his DNA profile was run against the Nightstalker case evidence, and bam, there was a match.
Wow, talk about a long game paying off. So after years of silence, the Nightstalker suddenly has a name and a face.
Yes, Linwood Forte was arrested at his workplace in Dudley. Imagine the shock and disbelief in the community. The man they had feared for so long had been living among them all along. But the story doesn't end there.
Oh, I knew there was more to it. What else did investigators uncover? I'm all ears.
Well, while Forte was awaiting trial, detectives made another startling discovery. They uncovered evidence that potentially linked him to yet another murder in Goldsboro, the 1994 murder of 46-year-old Dora Ann Thomas.
Hold on, so we have the Nightstalker attacks and now this additional murder that potentially ties back to Forte. Did they ever conclusively prove his involvement in Dora Ann Thomas's death?
That's where things get a bit complicated. While Forte was never officially tried for this murder, he remains the prime suspect. The evidence was strong enough to suggest a connection, but it never quite reached the threshold for a separate trial.
It's almost like peeling back layers of an onion, each revelation adding another dimension to this case. But let's focus on the Nightstalker trial itself for a moment. What was the atmosphere like? Given the DNA evidence, was there any doubt about the outcome?
The atmosphere was tense, heavy with anticipation. You could feel the weight of years of fear and uncertainty pressing down on the courtroom. And you're right, the DNA evidence was pretty damning. It painted a clear picture for the jury.
So how did Forte's defense team counter this seemingly irrefutable evidence? Did they offer any alternative explanations?
They actually faced an uphill battle right from the start. The DNA evidence was so strong that Forte's defense attorneys didn't even call any witnesses to the stand. It's easy to get caught up in the forensic details and legal proceedings, but we can't lose sight of the human cost of these crimes. The fear that gripped Goldsboro for years, the family shattered by loss, those wounds run deep.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Those ripples are felt long after the headlines fade. It's a reminder that we're talking about real lives torn apart, not just another true crime story.
Exactly. The Linwood Forte case is a particularly powerful example. Goldsboro at the time was a relatively small, close-knit community. So imagine the collective trauma when they realized that a serial killer had been targeting their elderly residents. It shattered the town's sense of security.
Makes you wonder, how do you even begin to rebuild that sense of safety after something like that? And it must have felt like anyone could be a potential victim.
That's the insidious thing about fear. It lingers long after the immediate danger has passed. It shapes behaviors, relationships, even the very fabric of a community.
Right, and for the families directly impacted by these crimes, I can't even imagine what they went through. We touched on this briefly before, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the long-term impact on those left behind.
The grief, the anger, the sense of helplessness, it's overwhelming. And in cases involving serial killers, there's this added layer of complexity. The families often feel robbed, not just of their loved one, but also of the chance to understand why.
That lack of understanding, that missing why, it must feel like a wound they can never truly heal.
Exactly. And without a clear understanding of why the families are left grappling with endless what-ifs and the feeling that justice, while served, can never truly mend their broken hearts.
It's tragic. And it raises so many questions about how communities and individuals can move forward after such trauma. It must be an incredibly difficult and painful process.
It's a long road to recovery, and it looks different for everyone. It requires a collective effort, from law enforcement offering support and resources to community leaders fostering a sense of unity and resilience.
Sounds like it takes a village to heal from something like this. So aside from the human impact, did the Linwood Forte case leave any lasting marks on the field of criminal justice?
Absolutely. This case really underscores the importance of DNA technology in solving cold cases without Forte's DNA being entered into CODIS. The Nightstalker murders might still be unsolved today.
You mentioned CODIS earlier. Can you explain a little bit more about how it works and why it's so significant?
Sure, CODIS is a powerful tool. It's essentially a vast network of DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders and crime scenes. It allows law enforcement to connect the dots even across state lines and over long periods.
So in Forte's case, his DNA, which was taken for a completely different offense, ended up solving these horrific crimes years later. That's incredible. But it also makes you think about the potential ethical considerations, right?
You're right. The use of DNA technology in law enforcement raises some important ethical questions. There are valid concerns about privacy and the potential for misuse. Balancing those concerns with the benefits of solving crimes and ensuring justice is a constant challenge.
It's definitely something to think about. But let's shift our focus back to Linwood Forte himself for a moment. What do we know about the man behind these horrific acts?
That's one of the most intriguing aspects of this case. Despite his conviction and the evidence against him, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about Forte's motives and his life leading up to the crimes.
So we have this puzzle with some missing pieces. We know what he did, but the why remains a mystery.
Precisely. And that's what makes this case so fascinating and so unsettling. It forces us to confront the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface, even in seemingly ordinary people.
It's a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. It can be hidden in plain sight, making it even more difficult to grasp.
It challenges our assumptions about good and evil, and it makes us question our ability to truly know the people around us. By all accounts, Forte was a seemingly normal member of the community. He held a job, had relationships, yet beneath that veneer of normalcy was a capacity for incredible cruelty.
Yeah, it's a reminder that monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they blend in, hiding in plain sight among us. And that's what I find so disturbing about this whole case.
It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil can exist anywhere and anyone, and that's a truth that can be both terrifying and incredibly unsettling.
This conversation has definitely given me a lot to think about. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the lingering fear in Goldsboro. Did the community ever truly recover from this experience?
It's a complex question. While the scars of those crimes undoubtedly remain, Goldsboro has also shown remarkable strength and resilience in the years since.
In what way? What did that resilience look like?
They've come together to support the victims' families, to honor their memory, and to work towards preventing such tragedies from happening again. There's a sense of shared purpose, a commitment to healing and moving forward as a community.
That's heartening to hear. So even amidst such darkness, there's a flicker of hope, a testament to the human spirit's ability to find strength and healing, even in the face of profound loss.
Absolutely. And I think that's an important message for our listeners to take away from this case.
Agreed. But before we get too sentimental, I'm curious to hear more about Linwood Forte's psychology. What do experts believe might have driven him to commit these horrific acts?
That's a question that has intrigued both investigators and psychologists alike. And while we may never have a definitive answer, there are some insights we can glean from examining Forte's background and the nature of his crimes.
Let's dive into that next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we're back and ready to kind of delve a little deeper into the mind of Linwood Forte. You mentioned that there are some insights we can gain from his background and the nature of his crimes. What can you tell us about his past? Was there anything that hinted at this darkness within him?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Forte's background doesn't really reveal any obvious red flags or glaring signs of a troubled childhood. He wasn't known for, violent outbursts or antisocial behavior.
So no clear indicators, no warning signs. That's even more unsettling in a way, isn't it? It makes it harder to predict or prevent these kinds of tragedies.
It certainly challenges our assumptions about how we identify potential threats. We often look for these clear-cut patterns or warning signs, but the reality is that evil can be incredibly deceptive.
It's almost like we're wired to look for the monster under the bed, but sometimes the real monster is sitting right next to us at the dinner table. It's a chilling thought.
It is, and it highlights the limitations of our understanding of human behavior. We may never fully grasp what drives someone to commit such horrific acts, especially when there's no clear history of violence or trauma.
So if we can't rely on past behavior to predict future actions, how do we make sense of cases like this? Is there anything we can learn from Linwood Forte's psychology that might help us prevent similar tragedies in the future?
Well, while there's no single answer, there are some theories about the underlying psychology of serial killers. One theory suggests that some individuals may have a genetic predisposition towards violence combined with environmental triggers that kind of activate those tendencies.
So it's a nature versus nurture kind of debate.
In a way, yes. It's likely a complex interplay of both genetic factors and life experiences that shape a person's capacity for violence. Another theory focuses on the role of fantasy and obsession in the development of a serial killer's mindset.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. The idea is that some individuals may develop these elaborate fantasies involving power control and violence, and these fantasies can become all-consuming, blurring the lines between reality and imagination. And in some cases, these fantasies may eventually spill over into real-life actions.
That's terrifying. It's like a nightmare scenario where the darkest corners of the mind manifest in the real world.
It is a terrifying thought, and it raises important questions about the role of mental health in preventing these kinds of tragedies. Early intervention and treatment for individuals who are struggling with violent fantasies or obsessive thoughts could be crucial.
That makes sense. But it also highlights the challenges of identifying those individuals before they act on those impulses. It's like trying to predict an earthquake before the ground starts shaking.
It's a daunting task for sure, and it underscores the need for more research into the psychology of violence and the development of effective prevention strategies.
So while we may never fully understand what drove Linwood Forte to commit these horrific acts, his case serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of human behavior and the urgent need to delve deeper into the dark side of the human psyche.
Absolutely, and it reinforces the importance of ongoing dialogue and research in the field of criminal psychology. By studying cases like Forte's, we can gain valuable insights that might help us prevent similar tragedies in the future.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Linwood Forte case. We've explored the chilling details of his crimes, the long road to justice, and the lingering questions that continue to haunt us.
This case has been a journey into the heart of darkness, but it's also been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
Well said. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Continue to explore, continue to question, and continue to seek understanding in the face of darkness.
And may we all strive to create a world where tragedies like this become less frequent, less devastating, a world where empathy and compassion guide our actions and illuminate even the darkest corners of our hearts.